The fog rolled across Whitman Air Force Base like a gray blanket, thick enough to swallow the outer perimeter fence and turn the world beyond the flight line into nothing but shadow and suggestion. Rebecca Martinez pulled her fuel line vest tighter. As she moved across the tarmac, the pre-dawn air biting through the worn fabric. Her name tag was barely readable after 5 years of washing. The letters faded to ghost impressions, but she didn't need it to prove who she was. Everyone knew the quiet woman who fueled their jets. The F-15 sat in perfect rows, their sleek bodies gleaming under the harsh runway lights. Each one represented millions of dollars and countless hours of engineering, but to Rebecca, they were something more. They were the aircraft she should have been flying. Her tablet beeped softly as she approached Jet 6, the morning's first bird scheduled for patrol. The fueling process was routine. By now, connect the line, monitor the flow, log the completion. But as she locked the coupler into place beneath the fuselage, something caught her eye. The tail fin had vibrated. Just once. Subtle, barely noticeable. But wrong. Rebecca had been around these jets longer than most of the pilots who flew them. She'd fueled every model in the Air Force inventory, logged more physical hours with these airframes than officers who barely knew her name. That vibration meant something. She pulled out her tablet and accessed the telemetry patch linked to Jet 6. There it was, a low flicker on the delta loop, echoing through her display. Not red, not even yellow on the warning scale, but definitely wrong. The frequency was off by just enough to matter. Sergeant Geller, she called to a tech walking past with his morning checklist. Can you take a look at the right stabilizer on 6? I'm getting a flutter in the echo trace. Might be nothing, but he didn't stop walking. His stylus tapped his screen casually. It's already cleared. Don't worry about phantom flags, Martinez. Happens every shift when tongue drop. The dismissal stung, but Rebecca had grown used to it. It's flickering at 100.0 kilohertz. The trace looks thin. Then it's thin. Go warm your hands or something. He was gone before she could respond. Rebecca stared at her screen as it dimmed back to idle. The data was still there, still wrong, but nobody wanted to hear it from the fuel tech. As she finished the fueling process, she watched Jet 6 through the lifting fog. The pilot climbed the ladder, Lieutenant Rollins, according to the manifest. Young, confident, probably fresh from flight school. He glanced down at her as he reached the cockpit. Appreciate the shine job, sweetheart, he said with a smirk. Ladder rails got your whole palm print. Next time, use a glove. Rebecca didn't reply. She stepped back as the engine spun up, feeling the familiar vibration through the concrete. But as Jet 6 began its taxi roll, she saw it again, that subtle wobble in the right stabilizer. Her stomach registered it before her eyes confirmed. The jet corrected itself and continued toward the runway. Within minutes, it was airborne, disappearing into the morning haze. Rebecca folded her gloves and turned back toward the fuel depot. Another aircraft was already inbound, its shadow emerging from the mist. She would prep the next coupler, fuel, the next jet, and nobody would ask what she saw. Nobody would review her sensor readings or check her concerns. If Jet 6 came back with a fault, it would be filed as normal wear and tear. Not a pre-launch warning. Not a visual flag from a support tech who used to dream of flying these same jets herself. The fog clung to her arms as she moved to the next station. The air tasted like metal and jet wash, and her boots left faint prints in the soft grid at the runway's edge. Another voice called out nearby, asking for pressure readings. She answered without raising her head. Jet 6 was somewhere above the clouds now, carrying its hidden flaw into the sky. Rebecca watched until even its contrail disappeared. Nobody would remember the woman who tried to warn them. They'd only remember the report that said everything looked normal until it wasn't. But Rebecca would remember. She always did. In her small trailer that night, she opened her personal flight log, a black notebook she'd kept since her training days. Under today's date, she wrote, Jet 6, vibration anomaly at 100.0 kHz. Warning dismissed. Pilot LT. Rollins. Flight duration. Unknown. She paused, then added one more line. They don't listen to fuel techs. Maybe they should start. Outside her window, the base was quiet, except for the distant hum of aircraft returning from patrol. Somewhere in that sound was Jet 6, hopefully intact. Rebecca closed the notebook and prepared for another day of warnings nobody would hear. The hangar smelled like solvent and warm concrete, the kind of thick air that clung to your clothes hours after you left. Rows of F-15s sat under the high ceiling, their canopies closed, noses pointed toward the bay doors, where harsh morning light cut through the lingering fog. Rebecca stood near a rack of equipment bins, a single printed report folded twice in her hands. Her handwriting covered the bottom half of the page detailed observations about Jet 6's stabilizer anomaly, frequency readings, and her recommendation for a full diagnostic check before the next flight. A group of officers and techs had gathered around the diagnostic station, their voices sharp as they ran through the morning debrief. Rebecca recognized most of them. Master Sergeant Hayes, the maintenance supervisor, Technical Sergeant Brooks, and Lieutenant Colonel Peterson, whose flight suit bore command insignia. She took a breath and stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said, clearing her throat. "I think this might be relevant to Jet 6. It flagged earlier vibration pulse, maybe. Transient, but I caught it at 100.0 kHz. Tech Sergeant Brooks turned first, squinting at the paper in her hand without taking it. A smirk spread across his face. "Fuel line duty, right? I thought you were on hose crew this week." Another tech leaned in with a grin. "She's upgrading. Now, from tanks to telemetry. Careful, next she'll be writing flight plans." Laughter rippled through the group. Rebecca held the report steady, arm extended, hoping someone would take it seriously. Brooks finally reached out, took the page between two fingers, and with a quick flick of his wrist, began folding it. Edge to corner, fold to crease. He worked with practiced precision until the paper became a narrow triangle. One last fold, and he had a perfect paper airplane. He turned slightly and tossed it toward a trash barrel against the wall, watching it arc lazily before bouncing off the rim and landing face down on the floor. "She's got range," he said, grinning, "but aim needs work. Fuel Barbie throws a mean paper trail," someone added from behind a gear rack. "Refuel Princess just wants to be heard," came another voice. More laughter overlapped with the clatter of a rolling cart and the pop of a compressor valve. Rebecca didn't react. Her hand lowered slowly. She bent down, picked up her work gloves from her belt loop, and turned to step back from the group. As she did, her eyes met someone else's across the hangar. Captain Diana Walsh stood near the wall, one boot resting on a case of hydraulic fluid. Her flight suit was immaculate pressed and lined with pilot insignia. She had been silent through the entire exchange. For a moment, she looked like she might speak. Her brow tensed slightly. But then she looked away. The briefing resumed. One of the officers tapped the diagnostic tablet again, pointing to Jet 6's status line. "Cleared to air. Stabilizer variance logged. Nothing actionable." Another nodded. "Transient load fluctuation. Same as yesterday. If it holds for more than 2 runs, we'll dig deeper. Until then, just watch the telemetry delta." Rebecca's hands flexed slightly at her sides, not clenched, just a motion of pressure with nowhere to go. She walked slowly along the hangar floor, past crates and tool carts, past engine covers and clipboards hanging off magnetic boards. The air felt cooler at the edge of the space. She stopped by the bay door, half in shadow, and looked out across the flight line. One of the jets was starting to taxi. She couldn't see the tail number from here, but she knew the sound pattern. It was Jet 6. Behind her in the hangar, someone was recounting a story about a missed target during night drills. More laughter. A mock imitation of a clipped tower call. The kind of conversation that carried effortlessly through open air. Nobody would remember what she tried to hand over. Nobody would log the paper. It wasn't scanned, wasn't official. She stepped outside, letting the sun catch her face. The fog had almost lifted now. Heat shimmered above the asphalt, and the horizon looked cleaner than it had earlier. On the hangar floor behind her, the paper plane still sat where it had fallen. Its nose was bent slightly from the impact, but the data written inside remained accurate. Nobody would read it. That evening, Rebecca sat in her trailer with her. Flight log open. She wrote carefully. Day 2. Formal report submitted Jet 6 stabilizer issue. Report dismissed without review. Converted to paper airplane by tJudgeByLooks. Data valid but ignored. She paused, then added, Captain Walsh was present. She saw everything. She said nothing. Outside, the sound of returning aircraft filled the evening air. Rebecca closed her notebook and wondered how many warnings it would take before someone finally listened. Tomorrow she would try again, because somewhere in the sky, Jet 6 was still flying with a flaw nobody wanted to acknowledge. And eventually, flaws had a way of making themselves known. 3 weeks later, Rebecca stood in the equipment shed, staring at a maintenance report that made her blood run cold. Jet 6 had experienced what the report called minor structural stress. During a training exercise over the Pacific, the right stabilizer had developed a hairline crack that required immediate grounding and repair. Lieutenant Rollins had brought the aircraft back on emergency protocol, fighting unstable flight characteristics for the last 30 miles. The report noted that early detection of this defect would have prevented potential catastrophic failure. Rebecca's hand shook as she read the technical summary. The frequency signature that had appeared on her readings 3 weeks ago, 100.0 kilohertz, was listed as the primary indicator for this type of structural failure. The exact same reading she had tried to report. The exact same reading that had been dismissed and turned into a paper airplane. She wasn't supposed to have access to this report. It had been left on the maintenance desk while Sergeant Hayes stepped out for coffee. Rebecca had only meant to drop off fuel consumption logs, but when she saw Jet 6 in the header, she couldn't help herself. The shed door creaked open behind her. She quickly placed the report back on the stack and turned around. Master Sergeant. Hayes stood in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Martinez, what are you doing in here? Dropping off the fuel log, Sergeant, as requested. She held up the clipboard with her daily reports. He stepped closer, his eyes flicking to the maintenance report on his desk. You read that? Rebecca hesitated. Lying to a superior was a serious offense, but so was unauthorized access to classified maintenance reports. I saw Jet 6's designation. I was concerned about the aircraft I had flagged earlier. Hayes picked up the report, scanning it briefly. His jaw tightened as he read. When he looked back at Rebecca, something had changed in his expression. You flagged this aircraft 3 weeks ago? Yes, Sergeant. Vibration anomaly at 100.0 kilohertz. I filed a report with the diagnostic team. What report? Rebecca's stomach dropped. I handed it directly to Technical Sergeant Brooks during morning briefing. He said it would be logged. Hayes set the maintenance report down carefully. There's no record of any report from you in the system, Martinez. Nothing logged, nothing filed, nothing reviewed. The silence stretched between them. Rebecca felt something break inside her chest. Not anger, exactly, but something deeper. a quiet refusal to accept what she was hearing. "Sergeant, I documented everything. The frequency readings, the telemetry data, the specific location of the stabilizer flutter. I observed it during pre-flight fueling operations. And you're certain of your readings?" "Absolutely certain." Hayes studied her for a long moment. "Martinez, you realize what you're telling me? You're saying you identified a critical defect that could have killed a pilot, and my diagnostic team ignored it. I'm saying I tried to report it through proper channels. What happened after that isn't my responsibility." Hayes leaned against his desk, the weight of the situation settling over him. "Do you still have your original notes?" "Yes, Sergeant. I keep personal logs of all my observations." "Good. Because if what you're saying is true, we have a serious problem. And it's not just about one aircraft." Rebecca's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" "I mean that if my techs are dismissing safety reports without proper review, it's happening to more than just you. How many other warnings have been ignored? How many other aircraft are flying with defects nobody wants to acknowledge?" The implications hit Rebecca like a physical blow. She thought about all the times she had seen something unusual, a vibration here, an anomaly there, and been told it was nothing. How many pilots were flying compromised aircraft because fuel techs weren't considered qualified to spot problems? "Sergeant, what happens now?" Hayes straightened up, his expression hardening with resolve. "Now we find out exactly what happened to your report, and we make sure it never happens again." He walked to his computer terminal and began typing. "I'm pulling the maintenance logs for the past month. Every aircraft you've serviced, every anomaly you might have observed. We're going to go through them one by one." Rebecca felt a spark of hope for the first time in weeks. "You believe me?" Hayes looked up from his screen. "Martinez, I've been in this business for 22 years. I've seen good people get dismissed because they didn't have the right rank or the right training. But I've also seen what happens when we ignore the people who actually touch these aircraft every day." He gestured toward the maintenance report. "You called this failure 3 weeks before it happened. That's not luck, that's skill. And if my people threw away your report without reading it, then they're going to answer for it." Rebecca nodded, feeling something she hadn't experienced in years: validation. "I want you to bring me everything," Hayes continued. "Every note, every observation, every piece of data you've collected. We're going to build a comprehensive review of every aircraft on this base." As Rebecca left the equipment shed, she felt lighter than she had in months. Finally, someone was listening. Finally, someone understood that her warnings weren't just the complaints of an overlooked fuel tech. They were the observations of someone who cared enough to notice what others missed. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Challenging. The diagnostic team meant challenging the established hierarchy. And hierarchies didn't change easily. That night, she sat in her trailer surrounded by 3 years' worth of flight logs, technical observations, and detailed notes. Tomorrow she would hand over everything to Sergeant Hayes. Tomorrow, the real fight would begin. Rebecca's trailer had become a war room. Maps covered her small table, flight logs stacked in precise piles, and printouts of technical specifications lined the walls. For the past week, she had worked every evening after her shift, documenting 3 years of observations that had been dismissed, ignored, or forgotten. The evidence was overwhelming. Jet 12 had experienced landing gear issues 2 months after Rebecca noticed hydraulic pressure fluctuations during refueling. Her report had been marked non-actionable by the diagnostic team. Jet 8 had suffered engine failure during a training mission. 6 weeks after Rebecca documented unusual vibration patterns in the intake manifold. Her concerns had been dismissed as equipment sensitivity. Jet 15 had been grounded for structural repairs after Rebecca noticed stress fractures near the wing joints. She had been told that fuel techs weren't qualified to assess structural integrity. The pattern was clear and disturbing. Rebecca wasn't just good at her job, she was exceptional at it. Her observations had predicted mechanical failures with startling accuracy. But because she didn't wear officer's bars or have a pilot's wings, her warnings had been systematically ignored. A knock at her trailer door interrupted her work. She opened it to find Master Sergeant Hayes standing in the cool evening air, a thick folder under his arm. "May I come in, Martinez?" "Of course, Sergeant." Hayes stepped inside and whistled blow at the organized chaos surrounding them. "This is impressive work. How long have you been keeping these records?" "Since I was reassigned to fueling operations. I thought maybe if I could prove my observations were accurate, someone would listen." Hayes set his folder on the table. "Well, someone is listening now. And what I found in the official maintenance records is going to make some people very uncomfortable." He opened the folder to reveal a stack of incident reports, safety reviews, and diagnostic logs. "I cross-referenced your personal notes with every mechanical failure on this base over the past 3 years. Martinez, you predicted 87% of them." Rebecca stared at the documents. 87%? "Your accuracy rate is higher than our diagnostic equipment. You're not just a fuel tech. You're a walking early warning system." Hayes pulled out a chair and sat down. "But here's the really interesting part. I found records of your reports. They were logged into the system, reviewed by the diagnostic team, and then systematically dismissed." "What do you mean, dismissed?" "I mean someone made deliberate decisions to ignore your warnings. This wasn't incompetence, Martinez. This was intentional." Rebecca felt a chill run down her spine. "Why would they do that?" Hayes leaned back in his chair. "Because acknowledging that a fuel tech could spot problems they missed would make them look incompetent. Because if word got out that critical safety information was coming from someone they considered unqualified, it would undermine their authority. So they put pilots at risk to protect their reputation? That's exactly what they did, and they documented it." Hayes pulled out a memo dated 2 years earlier. Rebecca recognized the letterhead. It was from Technical Sergeant Brooks, the same man who had turned her report into a paper airplane. The memo was addressed to the diagnostic team and read, "Excessive reports from fuel operations. Personnel are creating unnecessary workload and false alarms. Unless observations come from certified maintenance technicians or flight crew, they should be logged but not acted upon without secondary confirmation." Rebecca read the memo twice, her anger building with each word. "This is a policy? They made it official policy to ignore us. It gets worse." Hayes pulled out another document. "This is Brooks' efficiency report from last year. He was praised for reducing unnecessary maintenance actions and streamlining the diagnostic process. He got promoted because he ignored your warnings." Rebecca stood up and walked to her window. Outside, the flight line was quiet except for the distant hum of returning aircraft. Somewhere in that sound were pilots who had no idea they were flying aircraft with hidden defects. "Sergeant, what can we do about this?" Hayes joined her at the window. "We can make sure it never happens again. But it's going to require going over some heads and ruffling some feathers. I don't care about feathers." "Good, because I'm recommending you for immediate promotion to aircraft maintenance specialist. Your technical knowledge and observational skills are exactly what this base needs." Rebecca turned to stare at him. "But I don't have the formal training. You have something better. You have instinct. And 3 years of documented success that speaks for itself." Hayes pulled out a final document, a recommendation letter, addressed to Colonel Anderson, the base commander. "I'm also recommending a complete review of diagnostic procedures and the immediate suspension of any policies that discourage safety reports. Rebecca felt tears building in her eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. For the first time in years, she felt hope. "There's one more thing," Hayes said quietly. "I know you used to be in pilot training. I pulled your file." Rebecca stiffened. "That's in the past. Maybe it doesn't have to be. Your technical knowledge combined with flight experience could make you invaluable to this squadron. Have you ever thought about reapplying?" Rebecca looked out at the F-15s lined up on the flight line, their sleek forms barely visible in the evening darkness. She had thought about it every day for 3 years. "I was told my medical clearance couldn't be renewed." Medical clearances can be reviewed, especially when there's a demonstrated need and exceptional performance. Rebecca felt something shift inside her chest. Not just hope now, but possibility. "What happens next?" Hayes smiled. "Next, we present our case to Colonel Anderson. And we make sure that every pilot on this base knows that when Rebecca Martinez sees something wrong, they better pay attention." As Hayes gathered his documents, Rebecca looked around her trailer. The maps and logs that had felt like evidence of her isolation now looked like proof of her expertise. Tomorrow, she would walk into the colonel's office not as a dismissed fuel tech, but as a professional whose warnings had the power to save lives. The fight wasn't over, but for the first time, she wasn't fighting alone. Colonel James Anderson's office sat on the second floor of the command building, its windows overlooking the entire flight line. Rebecca had never been inside before, but as she followed Master Sergeant Hayes through the door, she noticed the walls were covered with photographs of aircraft, commendations, and a large map showing the base's area of operations. Behind the oak desk sat a man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Colonel Anderson gestured for them to sit in the chairs across from his desk. "Sergeant Hayes tells me you have some concerning information about our maintenance procedures, Martinez." Rebecca's heart pounded, but her voice remained steady. "Yes, sir. I believe there have been systematic failures in our safety reporting system. That's a serious accusation. I hope you have documentation to support it." Hayes placed the thick folder on the colonel's desk. "Sir, what we found goes beyond individual mistakes. This appears to be a deliberate policy to dismiss safety reports from non-certified personnel." Colonel Anderson opened the folder and began reading. His expression grew increasingly grave as he worked through the documents. After several minutes of silence, he looked up. "Martinez, you've been tracking aircraft defects for 3 years?" "Yes, sir. In my personal time, using observations from my daily duties. And according to this analysis, your predictions have been accurate 87% of the time?" "That's correct, sir." The colonel continued reading, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When he reached the memo from Technical Sergeant Brooks, his jaw tightened visibly. "This policy memo ... Were you aware this existed, Sergeant Hayes?" "No, sir. It was never distributed to maintenance leadership. It appears to have been an internal directive within the diagnostic team." Colonel Anderson set the memo down carefully. "So we have a team of technicians who decided on their own authority to ignore safety reports from qualified personnel." "Sir," Rebecca interjected, "I want to be clear that not everyone dismissed my concerns. Sergeant Hayes took my report seriously and conducted a thorough investigation." "Noted. But the fact remains that your warnings could have prevented multiple aircraft failures and potentially saved lives." The colonel stood and walked to his window, looking out at the flight line where afternoon operations were in full swing. "Martinez, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want a direct answer. In your professional opinion, how many aircraft currently on this flight line are operating with undetected defects?" Rebecca had been dreading this question, but she had prepared for it. "Sir, based on my recent observations and the patterns I've documented, I estimate at least 6 aircraft are showing early indicators of potential mechanical issues. Colonel Anderson turned back to face them. 6 out of how many? 24 operational aircraft, sir. 25% of our fleet. The colonel returned to his desk and picked up his phone. Get me Technical Sergeant Brooks and the entire diagnostic team in Conference Room B immediately. As he hung up, he looked directly at Rebecca. Martinez, I want you to present your findings to the diagnostic team. I want them to hear directly from you what they've been missing. Rebecca felt a flutter of nervousness. Sir, with respect, they haven't been receptive to my input in the past. They will be now, because this time, you'll have my full authority. Behind you. 20 minutes later, Rebecca found herself standing at the front of Conference Room B, facing the same group of technicians who had dismissed her warnings for 3 years. Technical Sergeant Brooks sat at the far end of the table, his expression carefully neutral. The other team members looked confused and slightly defensive. Colonel Anderson addressed the room. Gentlemen, we're here because it has come to my attention that critical safety information has been systematically ignored. Martinez, please present your findings. Rebecca opened her folder and began with Jet 6. She explained her initial observations, the report she had filed, and the eventual structural failure that matched her predictions exactly. She could see the realization dawning on several faces. As she connected her warnings to actual mechanical failures. When she finished with Jet 6, she moved on to Jet 12, then Jet 8, then Jet 15. Each case followed the same pattern. Early detection, dismissed warning, eventual failure. By the time she reached her 6th case study, the room was completely silent. In summary, Rebecca concluded, over the past 3 years, I have identified patterns that predicted mechanical failures with remarkable accuracy. However, my reports were either ignored or actively suppressed, resulting in unnecessary risk to flight operations and pilot safety. Colonel Anderson addressed the diagnostic team. Gentlemen, I want explanations. Starting with you, Brooks. Technical Sergeant Brooks shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir, Martinez is not a certified maintenance technician. Her observations, while well-intentioned, lack the technical foundation to support formal maintenance actions. Is that your professional opinion, or is that policy? Brooks hesitated. Sir, we developed guidelines to streamline our workload and focus on reports from qualified personnel. Guidelines that you failed to share with maintenance leadership or command staff. Sir, we felt it was within our operational authority to establish internal procedures. Colonel Anderson's voice grew cold. Your internal procedures nearly got Lieutenant Rollins killed when Jet 6's stabilizer failed. Your operational authority doesn't extend to ignoring safety reports. Rebecca watched as the dynamic in the room shifted. The diagnostic team, which had seemed so confident and dismissive for years, now looked uncertain and defensive. Martinez, the colonel continued, what would you recommend to prevent this situation from recurring? Rebecca had prepared for this question too. Sir, I recommend establishing formal protocols for safety reports from all personnel, regardless of rank or certification. I also recommend regular cross-training between fuel operations and maintenance teams to improve communication and technical understanding. Excellent recommendations. Consider them approved effective immediately. Colonel Anderson stood, signaling the end of the meeting. Brooks, your team will review every aircraft Martinez has flagged and take appropriate action. Any questions about the priority of this directive? No, sir. Good, because if I discover that safety reports continue to be ignored or dismissed, there will be career consequences. As the diagnostic team filed out, most avoided eye contact with Rebecca. But she noticed that a few of the younger technicians looked at her with something resembling respect. Colonel Anderson approached her as the room emptied. "Martinez, I want to discuss your future with this squadron. But first, I have a question. Sergeant Hayes mentioned you were once in pilot training?" Rebecca's heart skipped. "Yes, sir." "Several years ago. What happened?" "Medical Review Board pulled my clearance during Phase 2 training. I was reassigned to logistics, then fuel operations." The colonel nodded thoughtfully. "Would you be interested in having that medical clearance reviewed again?" Rebecca felt the world shift around her. "Sir, yes, absolutely yes." "Good, because this base needs people who can see problems before they become disasters. And from what I've seen today, that's exactly what you do." As Rebecca left the command building that afternoon, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: vindication. The system that had dismissed her for so long was finally listening. But she also knew this was just the beginning. Changing policies was easier than changing attitudes. The real test would come when she had to work alongside the same people who had spent 3 years treating her like she didn't matter. Tomorrow, she would find out if respect could be earned, or if it had to be demanded. 2 weeks after the confrontation in Colonel Anderson's office, Rebecca stood in the tower communications bay, officially cross-trained as a liaison between fuel operations and flight control. Her new position gave her access to real-time telemetry from all aircraft and the authority to flag potential issues directly to command. The morning had started routine. Fog rolled across the base, thick enough to blur the outer perimeter, but not unusual for early autumn. She was monitoring fuel consumption patterns when the alert tone cut through the communications bay like a blade. The sound wasn't the usual. A drill ping. This was sharp, urgent, and layered with overlapping voices on multiple channels. Rebecca turned instinctively toward the flight status board and saw the flash of red across the status column. "Alert status, no clarification," came the voice from the tower. "Unknown contact, bearing 270, altitude unknown, no transponder signal." Rebecca's training kicked in. She pulled up the radar display on her console, and there it was, a single blip moving at high speed just below standard flight. Corridors. No identification, no flight plan, no response to radio calls. The base had 2 F-15s airborne on routine patrol, but they were positioned on the eastern sector, too far away to intercept. The unknown contact was heading directly for restricted airspace. "Tower, this is ground control," came another voice. "We need an immediate intercept on the northern approach. How long to scramble Echo 3? Rebecca knew Echo 3's status without checking her board. The aircraft was on standby in the hangar, fueled and ready, but there was no pilot assigned. To the alert roster, ground control, Echo 3 is cold deck. No pilot on standby. Estimated time to crew and launch is 12 minutes. 12 minutes. Rebecca looked at the radar screen and calculated the unknown contact's approach speed. It would reach the restricted zone in less than 8 minutes. The communications bay erupted in controlled chaos. Officers rushed between stations, trying to coordinate a response to a situation that was unfolding faster than their procedures could handle. Someone was shouting about clearance codes. Another voice demanded visual confirmation from the tower. Rebecca stared at the radar screen, watching. The unknown contact maintained its course and speed. She had seen this type of signature before, too fast for weather, too erratic for civilian aircraft, too clean for a technical malfunction. While the command staff struggled to find a pilot and get authorization for launch, Rebecca quietly left the communications bay. She walked across the tarmac with deliberate steps, her newly issued flight line credentials giving her access to areas that had been restricted just weeks earlier. The hangar holding Echo 3 was only partially secured standard protocol for aircraft on standby alert. Rebecca had spent 3 years fueling this aircraft. She knew every system, every quirk, every startup sequence. More importantly, she still remembered her flight training from years ago. The muscle memory was still there, buried under years of disappointment but never truly forgotten. She reached Echo 3 and ran her hands along the fuselage, checking for any obvious issues. The aircraft had been her responsibility just that morning, fully fueled. All systems green, ready for immediate deployment. It was perfect. Behind her, she could hear voices from the tower growing more urgent. The unknown contact was now 6 minutes from restricted airspace, and the base still had no intercept capability. Rebecca made a decision that would change everything. She climbed the ladder to Echo 3's cockpit, her movements smooth and confident despite the years away from flying. The seat felt familiar as she strapped herself in. Her hands moved across the controls, automatically battery switch, fuel, check, throttle at idle. The startup sequence initiated with the familiar double chirp that she had heard thousands of times from the ground. But this time, she was the one causing it. Unauthorized engine start on Echo 3. Came a voice from the tower. Who was in that aircraft? Rebecca switched her radio to standby, not off, just quiet. She needed to focus, and she couldn't afford to be talked out of what she was about to do. The heads-up display came alive in familiar green cascades, navigation systems online, weapons systems safe and locked. She had no intention of engaging anything. This was pure intercept. As she taxied toward the runway, she could see ground crews scrambling around the tower. Someone was probably trying to reach Colonel Anderson. Others were likely attempting to find a way to stop her. But Rebecca had calculated the timing. By the time they organized any kind of response, she would either be airborne or the unknown contact would have reached restricted airspace. There was no time for committees or authorization codes. She reached the launch position and paused for one final systems check. Everything was green. Everything was ready. Rebecca pushed the throttles forward and felt the F-15 surge beneath her. The familiar pressure pushed her back into the seat as the aircraft accelerated down the runway. Fog swirled past the canopy, and then suddenly she was airborne, climbing into the gray morning sky. For the first time in years, Rebecca Martinez was flying. The tower's voice crackled through her radio, demanding identification and immediate return to base. She ignored it. Below her, the fog formed a perfect white blanket that hid the base completely. Above her, the sky was clear and infinite. She checked her radar and found the unknown contact immediately. It was exactly where her calculations had predicted 4 minutes from restricted airspace and closing fast. Rebecca banked toward the intercept vector, feeling the F-15 respond to her commands with precision and power. The aircraft was magnificent, and for a moment she allowed herself to remember why she had fallen in love with flying in the first place. But sentiment would have to wait. She had a job to do. The unknown contact appeared as a small speck against the horizon, moving fast and low. As she closed the distance, Rebecca could see it was military sleek, angular, with no visible markings or transponder signals. This wasn't the civilian aircraft that had wandered into restricted airspace. This was something else entirely. Rebecca maneuvered Echo 3 into position, not aggressively, but with clear intent. She flew parallel to the unknown aircraft, close enough to establish visual contact, but far enough to avoid any suggestion of hostility. Through her canopy, she could see the other pilot's helmet. No identifying marks, no flag insignia. The visor was mirrored, reflecting her own aircraft back at her. For several seconds, they flew together in tense formation. Rebecca maintained her position, blocking the route to restricted airspace without making any threatening moves. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the unknown aircraft banked away. No radio communication, no aggressive maneuvers, just a clean turn toward open water and international airspace. Rebecca watched it disappear into the haze above the ocean, then turned Echo 3 back toward base. The flight home was quiet. Number. Radio chatter, no demands for explanation. She maintained standard approach protocols and landed without incident. As she taxied back to the hangar, Rebecca could see a crowd gathered near the flight line. Officers, technicians, ground crews all, waiting to see who had taken an unauthorized F-15 on an intercept mission. She parked Echo 3 in the same spot where it had been waiting on standby, shut down the engines, and climbed out of the cockpit. Colonel Anderson was the first person she saw as she reached the ground. "Martinez," he said quietly, "we need to talk." Colonel Anderson's office felt different this time. The afternoon light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across his desk, and the weight of what had just happened hung in the air like smoke. Rebecca sat in the same chair where she had presented her maintenance findings weeks earlier. But now she wore a flight suit instead of fuel operations coveralls. "Martinez," the colonel began, his voice carefully controlled. "In 23 years of command, I have never had a member of my base take an unauthorized aircraft to intercept an unknown contact." Rebecca kept her eyes forward. "Yes, sir." "Do you understand the magnitude of what you just did? You violated direct orders, engaged in unauthorized flight operations, and potentially created an international incident." "Sir, I understood the risks when I made the decision." Colonel Anderson stood and walked to his window, looking out at Echo 3, which was now surrounded by maintenance crews conducting a full post-flight inspection. "The unknown contact you intercepted? We still don't know what it was. No transponder, no radio communication, no identification. It could have been anything from a test aircraft to a hostile reconnaissance mission. Sir, based on its flight characteristics and approach vector, I assessed it as a potential threat to the restricted zone. Standard intercept protocol calls for immediate response. Standard protocol also calls for authorized pilots and proper command clearance." Rebecca finally looked up. "Sir, with respect, standard protocol failed. The system couldn't respond fast enough, and the threat was imminent." The colonel turned back to face her. "So you decided to take matters into your own hands." "I decided that preventing a potential breach was more important than following procedures that weren't working." Colonel Anderson returned to his desk and sat down heavily. "Martinez, what you did was either the most reckless act of insubordination I've ever witnessed, or the most decisive response to a crisis situation. I'm still trying to figure out which." Rebecca remained silent, letting him work through the implications. "Your flight performance was flawless," he continued. "Clean takeoff, perfect intercept approach, textbook de-escalation. The unknown contact turned away without incident, and you brought the aircraft back without a scratch. Thank you, sir." "That wasn't a compliment, Martinez. That was an observation. Because now I have to decide what to do with someone who has demonstrated exceptional judgment and exceptional disregard for authority in the same action." The colonel opened a folder on his desk. "I've been reviewing your original pilot training records. Exceptional scores, outstanding flight performance, strong technical knowledge. Your instructors recommended you for advanced fighter training." Rebecca felt her heart skip. "Sir, my medical clearance was revoked." "Your medical clearance was revoked because of a paperwork error. A clerical mistake that was never corrected because no one bothered to advocate for you." Rebecca stared at him. "What?" "The review board flagged a minor issue that should have been resolved with additional testing. Instead, some bureaucrat marked your file as incomplete and moved on. You were never medically disqualified from flight status, Martinez. You were administratively overlooked." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. 3 years of believing she wasn't good enough. 3 years of watching others fly the aircraft she was meant to pilot, and it had all been a mistake. "Sir, I don't understand." If this was an error, why wasn't it caught during routine reviews? Because no one was looking. You were reassigned to logistics, then fuel operations, and your file was buried in the system. It took a direct request from my office to get your complete training record. Colonel Anderson closed the folder, which brings us back to today's little unauthorized flight adventure. You took an F-15 into a potential combat situation based on your own assessment of the threat. That level of independent judgment is exactly what we need in our pilots. Rebecca felt a mixture of hope and confusion. Sir, are you saying? I'm saying you have a choice to make. I can court-martial you for unauthorized use of military aircraft, which would end your career and probably land you in military prison. Or I can recommend you for immediate reinstatement to pilot training based on demonstrated competence and exceptional performance under pressure. The silence stretched between them. Rebecca felt like she was standing at the edge of a cliff, with her entire future hanging in the balance. There is one condition, the colonel continued. If you accept reinstatement to pilot training, you will be held to the highest standards. No special treatment, no second chances. You'll have to prove yourself all over again, and this time, everyone will be watching. Rebecca thought about the years of dismissed warnings, the paper airplanes, the smirks and condescending comments. She thought about the unknown aircraft that had turned away rather than test her resolve. Sir, I accept the conditions. Colonel Anderson smiled for the first time since she had entered his office. Good, because I've already contacted Flight Training Command. They're expecting you next Monday. As Rebecca prepared to leave, the colonel stopped her with one final comment. Martinez, what you did today was dangerous and technically insubordinate. But it was also exactly what a fighter pilot should do when faced with an impossible situation. You assessed the threat, made a decision, and executed flawlessly. He stood and extended his hand. Welcome back to flight status, Lieutenant Martinez. Rebecca shook his hand, feeling the weight of the title she had thought she would never hear again. Thank you, sir. As she left the command building, Rebecca looked out at the flight line where the F-15 sat in perfect rows. Tomorrow, she would be fueling them for the last time. Next week, she would be learning to fly them again. The system that had dismissed her warnings for 3 years had finally given her the ultimate validation, the keys to the aircraft she had always been meant to fly. But even as she walked toward her future, Rebecca knew the most important lesson she had learned wasn't about flying. It was about trusting her instincts, even when everyone else refused to listen. Especially when everyone else refused to listen. 6 months later, Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez walked across the same tarmac where she had once fueled F-15s. But now she wore pilot's wings on her flight suit and carried a helmet under her arm. The morning fog had lifted early, leaving the sky clear and bright, perfect flying weather. She stopped beside Echo 3, the same aircraft she had taken on that unauthorized intercept mission. The maintenance crew was just finishing their pre-flight inspection, led by a familiar figure. Morning, Martinez, Master Sergeant Hayes called out with a grin. She's all yours. Every system green, fuel topped off, and not a single anomaly. And the diagnostic reports, Rebecca smiled back. I trust your team's work completely, Sergeant. It was true. The maintenance procedures at Whitman Air Force Base had been completely overhauled following her recommendations. Every technician, regardless of rank or specialty, now had direct access to safety reporting systems. More importantly, those reports were reviewed by committee and acted upon immediately. The change had been dramatic. Mechanical failures were down 60%. Pilot confidence was higher than it had been in years. And the base had received commendations from Air Force Command for operational excellence. As Rebecca completed her walk-around inspection, she noticed someone watching from the edge of the flight line. Technical Sergeant Brooks stood near a maintenance cart, his expression unreadable. Their eyes met across the tarmac. To her surprise, he walked over. "Lieutenant Martinez," he said formally, then paused. "I owe you an apology." Rebecca stopped her inspection. "Sergeant? That report you tried to file about Jet 6, the paper airplane thing." He looked down at his hands. "I was wrong. Dead wrong. And my attitude could have gotten Lieutenant Rollins killed." Rebecca studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there. "We all make mistakes, Sergeant. What matters is learning from them." "I did learn. And I want you to know that your safety recommendations have been implemented across every maintenance team on this base. We're better at our jobs because of what you taught us." He extended his hand. "Good luck on your mission." "Today, Lieutenant." Rebecca shook it firmly. "Thank you, Sergeant." As Brooks walked away, Rebecca felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. The system hadn't just changed. The people within it had changed too. She climbed into Echo 3's cockpit, running. Through the familiar startup sequence that she now performed as a qualified pilot rather than an unauthorized borrower. The HUD came alive with navigational data for today's mission. A routine patrol over the same restricted airspace she had protected 6 months earlier. "Echo 3, you are cleared for takeoff," came the voice from the tower. "Roger, Tower. Echo 3 rolling." Rebecca pushed the throttles forward and felt the familiar surge of power as the F-15 accelerated down the runway. But this time, there were no angry voices on the radio demanding her return. This time, she belonged here. As she climbed through 10,000 feet, Rebecca's radio crackled with an incoming message. "Echo 3, this is Base Command. We have a potential contact bearing 285, altitude unknown. Are you available for intercept?" Rebecca smiled inside her helmet. "Base Command, Echo 3 is ready. Proceeding to intercept." She banked toward the contact coordinates, feeling the F-15 respond to her commands with precision and power. On her radar screen, she could see the unknown signature. Too fast for civilian traffic. No transponder signal, approaching restricted airspace. It was almost identical to the situation that had changed her life 6 months earlier. But this time, she wasn't a fuel technician stealing an aircraft to do a job no one else could handle. This time, she was exactly where she belonged, a qualified pilot with the training, authority, and support to protect the airspace she had always known she was meant to defend. As she approached the intercept coordinates, Rebecca thought about the journey that had brought her here. 3 years of dismissed warnings, countless nights documenting anomalies in her trailer, the humiliation of watching her reports turned into paper airplanes, and finally the moment when she had decided that doing the right thing mattered more than following the rules. The unknown contact appeared on her horizon, another sleek aircraft with no identifying marks. But this time, Rebecca wasn't alone. 2 more F-15s were converging from different vectors, forming a coordinated intercept formation under her command. "Echo Flight, this is Echo 3. Standard intercept approach, weapons safe. Let's see what we're dealing with." The 3 aircraft moved into position with practiced precision, blocking all approach routes to the restricted zone. The unknown contact held its course for several tense seconds, then banked away toward international waters, just as it had 6 months earlier. "Base Command, Echo 3. Contact is withdrawn from restricted airspace. Threat neutralized." "Roger, Echo 3. Outstanding work. Return to base." As Rebecca led her flight back to Whitman Air Force Base, she reflected on how completely her world had changed. She was no longer the invisible fuel technician whose warnings fell on deaf ears. She was Lieutenant Rebecca Martinez, fighter pilot, squadron leader, and the person other pilots looked to when something needed to be done right. But the most important change wasn't in her rank or her responsibilities. It was in the knowledge that when she saw something wrong, people listened. When she raised a concern, it was investigated. When she made a decision, it was respected. The system that had once dismissed her had been forced to acknowledge what she had always known, that competence and dedication mattered more than rank or pedigree, that sometimes the most important insights came from the people who were closest to the work, regardless of their position in the hierarchy. As Echo Flight touched down on the familiar runway, Rebecca looked out at the base that had become her home. The same hangars, the same flight line, the same F-15s sitting in perfect rows. But everything had changed because she had finally found the courage to make her voice heard. She taxied Echo 3 to its parking spot and shut down the engines. As she climbed out of the cockpit, Rebecca saw her old trailer in the distance, now occupied by another fuel technician who, thanks to the new procedures, would never have to wonder if anyone was listening to his observations. Master Sergeant Hayes was waiting for her as she completed her post-flight checks. "How was the mission, Lieutenant?" Rebecca pulled off her helmet and smiled. "Perfect, Sergeant. Absolutely perfect." As she walked toward the debriefing room, Rebecca passed the spot where her report about Jet 6 had been turned into a paper airplane. The memory no longer stung. Instead, it reminded her of how far she had come and how much the base had changed. She had started as a fuel technician whose warnings were ignored. She had become a pilot whose judgment was trusted. But more than that, she had proven that persistence, competence, and courage could overcome any system designed to keep people in their assigned places. The fog that had once hidden the truth had finally lifted, and Rebecca Martinez was exactly where she had always belonged, in the cockpit of an F-15, protecting the skies she had learned to read from the ground up. In the end, they hadn't just sent her to fuel the jets. They had given her everything. She needed to understand them, respect them, and ultimately master them. And when the moment came to prove herself, she was ready. This story is about more than just one person's journey from the flight line to the cockpit. It's about the power of persistence, the importance of trusting your instincts, and the courage to act when systems fail. Rebecca's strength wasn't loud, it was precise. Her presence wasn't always praised, but it was necessary. Maybe you felt invisible in rooms that needed your expertise. Maybe you've caught something others dismissed. If so, this story is for you. Your observations matter. Your voice has value. And sometimes, the most important thing you can do is trust yourself enough to act when it matters most. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.